Earlier, when we talk about pricing of derivative products, we basically have in our mind assumed that the underlying asset is really a financial asset, but that need not be the case. And in many cases, when we need to price financial derivatives, the underlying asset actually are not of financial asset. They may be real asset, or they may be even an abstract index or abstract variable in some sense. Then they can all be used as the underlying reference. Let me use that term rather than asset. Here I put in some examples for that. For example, that you can, in the soybean future, the underlying asset is actually a soybean, so it's not a real material there. Crude oil, natural gas, they're industrial materials that use as input, and you in a catastrophe bonds, what is really related to is certain measures of natural catastrophe, right? And in weather derivatives, we are talking about some certain made up values or measures. So for example, when we have the concept of heating degree days or cooling degree days, what they are, well, they basically is saying that people are quite comfortable at the 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So if the temperature is much higher than that, you may have to turn on air conditioning, so which uses electricity. So you may want to be mindful, hedge certain things like that. And if the temperature is so much lower than 65 degrees Fahrenheit, you may have to put on some heating, so which will cause certain uses of energy, and you may want to hedge them. So later on, we're gonna see some examples of that. So and to see how we can actually price a simple weather derivative. So if the current temperature, for example, is 80 degrees, then in this case, heating degree days will be 0, because you don't really need to turn on the heater. It's pretty warm. So, but you may want to put on a cooling degree day will be 15, because it's relatively warm in this case. And a particular financial derivative asset, derivative product may actually be written with the payoffs related to either the heating degree days or the cooling degree days, or the cumulative heating degree days or the cumulative cooling degree days. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to see an example of that later. But before we do that, let's take a look at what are the differences if you use a financial asset as the underlying asset versus a non-financial asset being used, or not even an asset, a certain abstract index or reference is being used as the underlying variable. And when we price derivative products that with those non-financial assets as the underlying asset or reference, then we need to be mindful of the characteristics that those assets may have. For example, a lot of the things that we have mentioned earlier, crude oil or natural gas, they're industrial inputs on so the supply and demand may play a very big role. In fact, for crude oil, a lot of the geopolitical factors actually made a lot of has a lot of impact to the actual prices. So if the Middle East has a certain instability there, then it heavily influences the price of crude oil. There's also a factor that's called convenience yield, which is actually very important. because unlike financial asset where you don't really have to keep them around with you for any use, you'll be very happy to actually have to have a features on it, and rather than keeping the actual asset itself with you, right? So you can feel very free or to buy futures on a particular stock. You don't really feel necessarily have a special attachment that you have to have a piece of this stock certificate with you. But for non-financial asset, this may be a factor. So if you are running a factory and if there are important supply, then to ensure that uh, there's no interruption to the production line itself, you may actually naturally want to hold certain things, your input materials, right, with you, that naturally provides certain value to you. So you will probably be less inclined to actually uh, go on the futures market and wait for delivery. Like, what if that delivery doesn't happen the way you want it, or it's delivered at a different place, you have to ship it to your factory, and there's just a lot of things can happen in between, and that may cost you to shut down your production line, which can be very, very expensive to shut it down and to reopen it. So there are certain convenience yields that may be available if there are important input materials. People may need to consider seasonality and certain assets that may not really be easily stored. I know there are some certain devices where you can use to store electricity, but massive storage of large amount of generated electricity is actually relatively difficult. And those massive storage capacity for electricity are very costly and expensive as well. So a lot of time, people, when they generate electricity, they really anticipate them to be used right away, rather than, if there's a supply, oversupply of electricity, they naturally believe that they can store them. So storage costs and convenience and difficulties, and they will come into become a consideration. So in modeling of the financial asset, that if we use electricity as the underlying variable. There may be shortages and there may be jumps, so prices may not really be continuous for certain non-financial assets. Although even for financial assets, they may experience jumps as well, but certainly for non-financial asset, shortages and those things can be a very good reason for jumps to happen. Now, one of the key example we may have is that we know that there has been incidents that the futures market on crude oil has gone to negative because of the need to take delivery, because the product is physically settled, and people that are long futures on crude oil are not the ones with the capacity. A lot of them are not the ones with capacity to actually take physical delivery, and they're forced to actually offset their long position, meaning that they have to short it before maturity of the futures contract to avoid taking delivery, and that forces the product, forces the price of the crude oil futures to go to negative. And if it's a futures for a stock, and it will be very hard pressed to see the futures price to actually go to negative, because taking delivery, there was no delivery actually for financial asset. But even if you need to take a piece of paper for that stock certificate, isn't really a big deal. So characteristic in non-financial asset or characteristic of certain variables that I use as a reference for derivative products can have very different nature and requires additional care in modeling so that for us to be able to price derivative products with those assets as underlying. So extra cares are required. But having said that, of course, as a first, as a sort of a first encounter, people tend to specify a relatively simple process. Like usually you assume them to take log normal processes. But if you are having a very specific contract, you may have to think about those additional factors. Just like the example of this negative price of crude oil futures, if you ignore those differences, which a lot of the funds actually ignored it, that particular physical settlement feature, and has caused a lot of losses for those holders of those financial assets. Now let's take a quick look at an example. Say we have an option that pays $10,000 per degree day, which we sort of encountered it here. That defines heating degree day or cooling degree day. So in this case, if A is 80, we have cooling degree day being 15. So taking the per degree day on cumulative heating degree days for 1 month, and the same month next year over and above the strike price of 700 degree days. So if it's greater than 700 degree days, per degree day is get paid $10,000. And this is just a demonstration of how we could price them in a relatively simplistic manner. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we need to take care of the actual process in modeling. Suppose we assume that it follows a log normal distribution for the cumulative heating degree days, and the mean is 710, and the standard deviation is 7%. Okay, then it's easy to find a risk-free rate. Let's say in this case it's 3%. Then in this case, we can really make use of Black's formula for this. So we just use the mean as for F naught here, and the strike is 700, and really the quantity, the notional is 10,000 per degree days, and this is basically calculating the value per degree days of that option. And then from here, we know that the price of this particular option will be $243,400. What it shows here is, in order to price, we can basically utilize what we have learned for the modeling techniques or the pricing techniques that we have learned on financial assets, and to really make use of that. So in this case, we turn our problem into a problem where we can use the Black's formula. The important thing is we need to figure out what the risk neutral model is, and we need to consider, if applicable, the special natures of those underlying assets. Here, we really didn't really, as a simple model, we just assume that the heating degree days here follows a log normal distribution. But you may want to have a fancier distribution here, as the risk neutral distribution. But in those cases, you may not be able to get a good closed form solution. So here, after you're assuming the heating degree days that has a log normal distribution, you at least get a quick and dirty estimate of the value of this option. So you can use it as a baseline, and then you can develop something fancier and then compare to this baseline here. So this is just to demonstrate that to price those derivative products that are using non-financial asset as the underlying asset, still more or less follows the same general approach as we have learned earlier. Now, the other thing that the techniques of pricing derivative products is important to us is that a lot of times some of the real business decisions, you can actually transform that into a pricing problem for derivative products. So, the problem itself doesn't sound like that, but you can actually turn that into a problem that we know how to handle, and that provide and following the approach we have learned so far in the course, and provide the pricing, and that pricing itself is a variable business information that helps the decision-making process. So let's take a look. So for example, we have a company that is offered, so somebody is giving this company an option to lock in the lease of 100,000 square feet of office space at $35 per square foot 2 years later, 2 years from today, for a 5-year term with the cost of $1 million. Now, typically you may, if you're running a business, you may actually get offered for this kind of options or choices by your landlord, right? Because the landlord wants to lock in the price. So you have a long-term lease and to reduce uncertainty. Then the decision is, am I going to take take this particular choice or not, which has been offered to me? And does it make financial sense to do that? And in fact, we can turn this into a pricing question. And is it worth more than $1 million in this particular example? If it's worth more than $1 million, yeah, because then we should take this option because it's only cost us $1 million to do this. So let's see how the techniques that we have learned so far in the course can actually help us to make a more rational business decision here. Now, suppose we know the current spot lease rate is $30 per square foot, and let's say we expect there's some growth of the lease rate. It's at 12% per year, and with some volatility, some uncertainty of that growth rate. And we obviously always know the current risk-free rate, which in this particular example is at 5% per annum. So we can actually apply what I've learned so far in this particular case. So let's see. Now, if you structure this problem you see that if the lease rate is higher than 35, obviously is good for the company. And the reason it's a max function here is that it is an option that so the company, they don't have to get stuck in this one. If they really, 2 years from now, then they know the lease rate is not going to be high, then they can just say, forget about this. They take a write-off of this $1 million, but then they don't have to take that 5-year lease at $35. So this basically specifies the payoff of the option 2 years from today. That's why we have to make that a discount for 2 years, because we're looking at an option that matures 2 years from today. And the option is for 5 years. So for each of the year, we're looking at this particular expectation here, which conveniently we can choose the risk neutral world, because we just want to take an expectation here to calculate the price, right? So we want to take the risk neutral world as the where we can take the distribution. Oh, sorry, where we can take the expectation. So for each of the year, we take expectation, we discount it. So the first one is we discount it for 1 year, and then discount for 2 years. And if second year, then we discount for 2 years, and we take another discount for 2 years to the present. So now, so if we do that, we basically transform this value. It's equal to this particular expression here. Then the question here is to figure out this expectation. Now, if we assume log normal process for the least cost, then we know what this expectation is. We know that in order to evaluate this expectation here, we know this expectation turn into an expected value of the lease times ND1 and minus 35, which is a strike, times ND2, right? And now, once we have done that, now here we just left with this expected value, risk neutral expected value of the lease rate. And if we do have a forward lease rate 2 years from today, we can just plug that in, and we can solve for this value V and see whether it's greater than $1 million or not. But if we don't have that forward price available in the market, typically you would not have. Then we have to figure out what is the risk neutral expected value of this lease rate 2 years from today. And we know in risk neutral world, everything grow at a risk-free rate. So, we're taking the current lease rate, the lease, which is, I believe, $30. And then you grow that at the risk-free rate for the time here, okay? And well, here the risk-free rate for the lease may not necessarily be 5%. When you look at what you observe, the expected growth, which you'll probably can get that from historical data, let's say it is 12% per year. And you will know that it's actually related to risk-free rate plus some, risk price and to the volatility, modified by the volatility here. And so you may have to do some estimation here. So the volatility, let's say of the growth rate is say 20%, then you really have to measure the risk price, which is not a very easy thing to do. So a lot of the thing that we're talking about here, when you use the real asset, you will have to do some estimation to, unless you have certain financial asset, you can actually back out certain things. But if you are not in that situation, you may have to, you use those kind of conditions to actually back out some of the things you would need. Let's say for the sake of argument here, the price, risk price is 0.3, then you somehow come up with a 6% here, okay? So you on the other hand, you may say that, okay, I know the risk rate for financial assets at 5%, but this is probably not financial asset, so you'll be somewhere around 5%. Then you can do some estimate and to get a number around this. Now suppose you estimated that the rate 6% or about that, then you will know the expected value of the lease rate is at 33.82. Then you will see that in this case the option is worth 1.3586 million, which in this case it shows that it is actually a good option to take, because they charge you $1 million for something that we believe is worth 1.3586 million. So that basically turns a business decision into a financial product valuation problem. And what we learned here can obviously help answer that question. So this example is basically just a very simple case to demonstrate that. Obviously, we may not want to assume log normal. There's a lot of modeling consideration that one can have here, but nonetheless, the approach will be the same. So a lot of the business decisions are really giving us the opportunity to utilize what we have to what we have learned so far in pricing financial derivatives to actually answer those questions. A lot of the investment opportunities, we basically need to figure out what's the risk neutral expected value, and then following some techniques similar to this, we can get this being evaluated, and that will help us make certain decisions in our real business situations.